In 1942, the Pacific skies belonged to Japan. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, sleek and ghostly, ruled them with an almost mythic aura. It was light, agile, and lethally efficient, a weapon that seemed to defy the laws of physics and the limits of fear. American pilots, flying outdated Wildcats, met it with bravery but little hope. The Zero could turn inside any U.S. plane, climb faster, and hit harder. For the first year of the war, Japanese pilots laughed, and they had reason to. Their aircraft had no rival. Their skill, forged in China and tested at Pearl Harbor, was unmatched. The Imperial Navy's flyers were veterans before many Americans had even seen combat. But the laughter would not last. Somewhere across the Pacific, in a Long Island factory and a handful of U.S. Navy testing fields, engineers and pilots were quietly building something new. A fighter born not from theory, but from loss. The Grumman F6F Hellcat began as a response to pain, to humiliation, and to the desperate need to take back the skies. It was not the fastest aircraft of its generation, nor the most elegant, but it was built for one thing: to kill Zeros. The first prototypes rolled out in mid-1942, under the relentless hum of war production. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, had studied the early reports from the Pacific. Reports drenched in blood and frustration. He knew the Navy needed something that could survive, something that could give rookie pilots a chance against Japan's deadly aces. The F6F was designed around that idea: rugged, forgiving, and deadly in the right hands. At first, Japanese intelligence dismissed it. Photos and reports trickled in: a stubby, barrel-chested fighter that looked clumsy compared to the elegant Zero. Pilots who encountered early Hellcats mocked them, calling them flying oil drums. But that laughter was built on ignorance, and it would soon be silenced by gunfire over the Central Pacific. By the time the Hellcat entered combat in late 1943, the tide of the war had already begun to shift. The U.S. Navy had rebuilt its carrier fleet, trained a new generation of aviators, and was pushing westward with a momentum that no longer seemed stoppable. Yet in the skies, the memory of the Zero still haunted them. Every pilot had heard the stories of dogfights lost before they began, of tracers carving through aluminum like butter. They feared the Zero's agility, its ability to vanish in a turn. What they did not yet know was that the Hellcat had been built to counter every one of those fears. In a dogfight, the Zero's strength was maneuverability. It could outturn nearly anything. But its weakness, as U.S. test pilots had discovered with a captured Zero in 1942, was its fragility, its lack of armor, its inability to dive fast without tearing itself apart. The Hellcat exploited every one of these flaws. It couldn't turn as tightly, but it didn't need to. It dove faster, climbed harder, and could take a beating that would rip a Zero to shreds. Pilots were trained not to fight the Japanese on their terms. Never turn with a Zero. Dive, climb, roll. Keep the energy high, use the vertical. The Hellcat was built for that kind of fight. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns spat out death at a rate no Japanese airframe could endure. And soon, the balance began to shift. The first major test came over the Marshall Islands in early 1944. American carriers launched wave after wave of Hellcats into the humid skies. Japanese pilots, still confident in their own superiority, rushed to meet them. What followed was not a duel. It was an execution. The Hellcats tore through the Zeros with ruthless precision. Dive attacks, high-speed slashing runs, teamwork drilled to perfection. The Zero pilots tried to turn inside them, but the Americans refused the bait. They climbed, rolled, and struck again. By the end of the campaign, the Navy had claimed nearly 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed. for the loss of fewer than 30 Hellcats. For the first time, the Empire's laughter had turned to disbelief. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would shatter it completely. It was the largest carrier battle in history, and the moment the Hellcat achieved its grim destiny. That morning, over 400 Japanese aircraft launched from their carriers, hoping to halt the American advance toward the Marianas. They were met by a wall of Hellcats, waiting, calm, and deadly. The ensuing slaughter would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Hellcats fell upon the incoming Japanese formations with practiced discipline. Their radar-equipped carriers had given them early warning. Their tactics, now refined, turned the sky into a killing field. Many of the Japanese pilots were green replacements, barely trained, facing Americans who had hundreds of hours of carrier combat experience. The result was inevitable. In a single day, the Hellcats shot down more than 300 enemy aircraft. Some Japanese squadrons never returned at all. The once mighty air wings of the Imperial Navy were annihilated, not by luck, but by engineering, training, and the ruthless mathematics of war. But behind those numbers were human faces, young men on both sides, burning and falling into the sea. Pilots who had once laughed at the Hellcat now fought for their lives against it. Some survived long enough to understand their mistake. The Zero's lightness, once its greatest advantage, had become its curse. Its unarmored cockpit turned every bullet into a death sentence. Its fuel tanks, unprotected, burst into flame with the first hit. The Hellcat, heavier and slower to roll, could take dozens of rounds and still bring its pilot home. It was not beautiful, but it endured. By late 1944, Japan's skies were no longer a sanctuary. The Hellcat prowled from island to island, escorting bombers, hunting ships, and sweeping enemy airfields. It destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft, more than any other U.S. Navy fighter of the war. The kill ratio was staggering, 19-1. Behind each of those statistics was a story of survival, of learning, and of vengeance for Pearl Harbor, Wake, and the Coral Sea. There was irony in that. The Hellcat, designed as a reaction to Japan's dominance, had not just matched the Zero, it had erased it. What had once been an unstoppable symbol of imperial air power had become a relic, outclassed by a machine the Japanese had once mocked. Yet the men who flew the Hellcat never saw themselves as invincible. They knew the cost. They had seen the ocean littered with burning fuel, had heard the cries of comrades over the radio, had felt the shudder of flak tearing through wings. They carried that weight with them, even as victory drew near. In the closing months of the war, as kamikaze attacks began, the Hellcat took on a new role. Interceptor of desperation. It climbed into the dawn, chasing pilots who no longer fought to win, but to die. For every kamikaze that reached an American ship, several were cut down by Hellcats before they could strike. The war had changed, the enemy had changed, but the machine endured. By August 1945, when the Emperor finally spoke the words of surrender, the Hellcat had written its name into history. More than 12,000 were built, a testament to American industry and to the men who needed a weapon strong enough to survive their own courage. Many were scrapped soon after, their purpose fulfilled. A few became training aircraft, some museum pieces, others left to rust on forgotten airfields across the Pacific. But their legacy remained, a reminder that wars are not won by perfection, but by adaptation. The Zero had been perfect in its way, a dancer's blade, swift and elegant. The Hellcat was something else entirely. It was the hammer that broke that blade. Some historians argue the Hellcat's dominance was as much about timing as design, that Japan's pilot corps was already in decline, that American logistics and radar made the difference. And they're right, in part. But machines reflect the men who build them. The Hellcat was not just a product of engineering. It was a response to loss, fear, and determination. It embodied the hard truth of war. Survival favors those who learn fastest. In the end, the laughter that once echoed over the Pacific faded into silence, replaced by the roar of Hellcat engines climbing toward the sun. The same skies that had once belonged to the Zero now belonged to the men who had refused to give up. And somewhere in that endless blue, between clouds and memory, the ghosts of both still fly, the hunter and the hunted, forever circling in the quiet after victory.